and welcome to the fourth episode of the the Community Talk Show. I knew I was going to flub that up initially. We have we're three altogether, but we have a new member of the podcast here today. Ava's over here. How are you doing? Welcome.
Doing well. Hello.
And Monster is back with us for another week. How are you doing, Monster?
Hello.
So this
Twitch chat.
This is a very special episode because we are just going to harp on for the entire episode about Final Fantasy, which I think, the three of us are all on board with that, right? We're cool with it?
Oh, yes.
Excellent.
Very much so.
So we have a lot to discuss that we've been purposely holding back on. We initially had some minor conversations within Zoom and also in our group chat, and it was like, please, we need to hold back because that is good content. So I'm going to start off with basically how we got into the series itself. I'll start with my own story, I suppose. I played it a very long time ago, back on and people can correct me on this one, when it was Mystic Quest. It was Final Fantasy Mystic Quest, which was on the SNES as far as I remember. I have to remember this. So that was my first introduction to it, and it generally the kind of RPGing idea, it was such a big, strange, cool world to me, and I was fascinated by that, and I kind of left it aside for a while until I got into obviously the big one after that. For me, I believe was Final Fantasy VII, because it was, I can't remember, do you know what year that came out, or do you remember what year that came out?
97, I think.
Well, 97, okay, right, so I was 6 years old. So I don't think I played it exactly when I was 6, but I played it at a time around that age where I was quite young, and my friends would do the classic thing where we would pass the controller back and forth, and then from there I became an avid fan of the entire series and pretty much played all of the ones that mattered. We'll bring that a point up back later, but the ones that mattered, and then 9 subsequently became a favourite one throughout the years, and always has been. I even replayed it to make sure that it was, as I was older, just to make sure, was it just pure nostalgia, but actually it still holds up today, which is really fantastic. But I want to go to our other members of the podcast here. Monster, tell me about your introduction to the Final Fantasy series.
Yeah, it's a remarkably similar story to yours. I had a Sega Mega Drive when I was very young, and I played like old games like Sonic. And then I was at my cousin's house one day, and his older brother had a PlayStation, and they were playing Final Fantasy VII. And I remember just looking at them, and it blew my mind that a game could have a real story. Like, it wasn't just Sonic chasing Robotnik through every level. And I think a big part of it too was that I had never come across a science fiction story before, and so a story like that takes place in a completely different world really appealed to me. And even like the graphics, I remember thinking, like, when I saw the graphics, I thought graphics can never be as good as this. They'll never improve on this. Like, this basically looks like real life. And so I got a PlayStation from Santi that Christmas. I think I got up at like 4 or 5 in the morning, and I just played it all day. Yeah, and I was hooked from that point on.
I'm just thinking there, and this is completely unrelated, but you mentioned this, Monster, but Ave, over in the US, what do you call the person who gives you presents at Christmas time?
Santa.
That's so here we call him Santi.
Santi.
I think that's like a very Irish thing to call him. But anyway, that was just like something that I picked up on there. But you're so right. I mean, at the time as well, particularly, those worlds were so huge. It was unbelievable. Your imagination just ran completely wild. And I know I mentioned this previously, but you know what? You can't find the episodes anyway because I lost the audio, but whatever. But on previous episodes, I think it was 1 or 2, we were just discussing how the remake itself, it's an example of how this is actually what we had within our imagination. Even though, playing back the old Final Fantasy VII game, it certainly doesn't look like that now, but that's exactly how we imagined it. And I think that's what makes those games particularly special too. Ave, tell me how you got into the series.
So I got into the series, I think I had just discovered like kind of fantasy novels around the same time. I was really young, and I went so there's a video store near us where you could also rent Nintendo and Super Nintendo games. And I rented Final Fantasy IV, of course at the time it was Final Fantasy II in the US. And I was like, whoa, this is wild. Your characters, they have these relationships. The main character changes. Not only does he change how he looks, he completely changes how he plays, like a chunk of the way through the game. And I was like, this is awesome. This is so cool. I want more of this. And actually, the release of Final Fantasy VI/3 was right around the corner. And my parents humored me and gifted me a copy. And after that, it was all Final Fantasy all the time for me, basically.
Oh, that's just great. And I totally understand that feeling, Final Fantasy all the time. That is such a mood. That is such a big mood. And I also want to touch on, actually, because we just briefly talked about this before we went live, but your actual username, tell me about the background towards that.
Yeah, so the username, everyone gets tripped up on it. As I've remarked, there's no real right way to pronounce it, but the kind of story behind it is that it was a random permutation on Avaelin, Avaelin, which is the Romanized version of the word Abine, which is the Japanese name for Irvine Kineas from Final Fantasy VIII. So if you go back far enough, I am named, my handle is a Final Fantasy character.
I mean,
Yeah.
that's pretty hardcore. I really like that, because that's just kind of the same with mine as well. And a lot of people I know, Monster knows this because I've probably explained this a million times before. But my actual name here, Unitex, is based on two of my favorite characters, which is General Beatrix, which Monster is gladly showing off my emote there. Yep. Thank you kindly. And
the flag.
That's it, exactly, yeah. And also we have Lady Una, obviously, from Final Fantasy X. So it's a combination of both names. And I think that I think you probably told me that before, Abe, but it was just like one of those things like, yes, that makes so sense. Irvine also gets a lot of flack from 8 a lot of the time for obvious reasons, I think.
He does. I personally, I wouldn't say I identify with Irvine. Here's another fun fact. At the time, I was in high school, and my hair was long and in a ponytail, and I looked a little like Irvine. So that is why I decided I would make that like my moniker at the time, even though he's kind of lame.
Yeah. Did you have the hat, though? Did you have a cowboy hat?
There were hats, but I would not wear them.
I'm actually trying to imagine this, and I don't think I can.
Not the ankle length fur coat. No, you didn't.
No. Although I did like a long coat. I still favor like a long winter coat if the weather's cool. But
I have seen a lot of cool cosplayers who do some good Irvine. So I feel like you could do this someday. I have a feeling.
Maybe. I feel like that time has passed, but you never know.
Well, you never know, exactly. You know, 8 is one of those things where it's kind of, 8 is obviously a divisive game anyway, because it's kind of, it gets to a stage where it's sort of wacky. Would you, Monster, what will be your actual favorite game in the entire series?
9, I think. I think it has the best character development and like the relationship between the cast. Like there's no one best character, like it's the best ensemble cast.
Yeah.
I really like how in the beginning they really kind of forced to be on the same journey, and then very slowly they become friends. Very slowly start to respect and admire each other. And I think it has the best like love stories too, like Zidane and Garnet. And
that's one thing that 9 is one of those things where I always say that it's like a love story to all the other previous Final Fantasies that went before it, which is really, really great, because it just kind of, I mean, what I really like about 9 in particular, which is also obviously my favorite game, but in the series, and my favorite game in general, what is really fantastic about it is that it was fan servicey, but not too fan servicey. And I think there's a balance. There's definitely a balance within it, which sometimes you get from other games. I can't really think of one off my head, but I'm sure you can probably think of one where the fan service was just it was a bit too on the nose.
Metal Gear Solid 4.
There you go, perfect example.
That's good, yeah.
And just a really long game and a million cutscenes that had to do with that. Although I have to say, just speaking of Metal Gear, I know this is the Final Fantasy episode, but with Metal Gear, I have done a thing recently where myself and my other half will just watch them as a movie. So it cuts out all the gameplay and we just sit down and watch it and be like, this is...
Yeah, there are YouTube videos where you can just watch it as a movie, yeah. I've done that.
Yeah, it's so good. It's more satisfying this way. I know, like, I actually do really like 4. I just think that there's a lot of, obviously, Metal Gear Solid 4, rather, that there's a lot of fan servicey stuff to do with that. And following on, like I said, 9 is also my favorite for many of the reasons that it's probably Monsters too. I mean, the music in it in particular is pretty immaculate. And Nobuo Uematsu said that making the 9 music was his, and 9 in general, so is his favorite. So what about you, Abe, though? I think you have different thoughts on this one.
So, yeah, I mean, it's tough for me to pick one specifically. 9 I love for all of those reasons, although the one I decided to kind of like double down on being my favorite, even though I haven't replayed it in a long time, is 6. But for a lot of the same reasons. It has a wide-ranging cast that starts off not really knowing each other, and you get to learn about their relationships with each other as they grow, and also their relationships like that kind of define them as a person before they came onto the scene. And you start to see those inklings of the sci-fi leanings that are going to come in strong in 7 and 8. That starts to really crop up. And also the music, it was super formative for me, because that's right when I was kind of the age where I was starting to get really into wanting to play music. I had already been playing the trumpet as part of the school band, but I was like, that's when I wanted to learn the piano. I wanted to kind of get into somehow making some kind of music. Like, that was all new to me, but it was a lot of that soundtrack that drove me. And then the other thing about it that for me really makes it stand out still in Final Fantasies is that a lot of people talk about how like some Final Fantasies favor non-linearity and others are very rigid. Like, that game, I feel like, I mean, it's not complicated in how it does it, but it's pretty brilliant that like the big major first chunk of the game is very like, you go here, you talk to this person, you go here, you talk to this person. There's a chunk where you can do parts of it as different parties in a different order, but as far as the game is concerned, it's all happening at the same time. And then you get to that second half of the game and it's just like, go where you want. Also, the bad guy already has won. Like, it's cool. Like, and the way the music changes, the characters change, the map changes after that. For me, like, I was thinking about it because there's other games that I really like, but I was like, for that, I have to say 6 is still my favorite after all these years.
6 is the one with the opera, isn't it?
It is the one with the opera.
Yeah, which is so exceptional that they wrote in an entire opera within a game. Which obviously there's no voices, but you can hear the notes going for each. So it doesn't even matter that you don't actually hear voices replicating. It's such an incredible experience, and the fact, like you said, that the bad guy does win, and this is such an unusual thing for a game to do because you expect that to appear at the end or something like that. 9 actually did a similar thing, I think, to 6 in the sense that it was linear to a point, and then it was like, we can just go off into the distance and do whatever you want and check out this island, which I really liked, and which is kind of maybe, this is another conversation, I guess, because the most recent one we have, obviously, not including the remake, but was 15, right? That was so, which I've played. You've played as well, Ave, have you?
I have.
Okay.
I have very mixed feelings about
I know, yeah. Monster, have you played 15?
No.
Okay,
no,
right. So there are a lot of issues with 15. When I first played it, and I got a platinum in it, no flex, but it was just one of those things.
Humble brag.
I know, just humble brag.
Flex away, because there's no way I'm doing it.
Okay, right. So it was one of those things where, as I was playing it to get the platinum specifically, because that's what I like doing, I saw the value in it, and I actually really enjoyed it. If I was the average player who does not hunt for platinums, I can see so many issues with it. And I think I glossed over some of the issues on while I was getting that platinum, because I was doing absolutely everything to do with the plot and everything, and kind of made my experience towards the end even more enjoyable. We are going to talk about spoilers for 15, by the way, so either mute your ears or do whatever. But it's at a certain stage where the things that happened to the characters at the end really affected me more, because I'd spent more time with the characters. The issues that we might as well just go through each Final Fantasy and talk about their issues. But their issues with 15 in particular was that it was structured really weirdly, in that it started open world, which is great, wonderful, and then at a certain part of the game, it got linear all of a sudden, which just did not make sense. And you're gearing yourself up to go to these big towns and cities, and you just end up going onto one street, and it's the most boring city ever invented.
Complete reverse of every other classic Final Fantasy.
Yeah, and it's especially the city. It's Altissia, I think, is the name of the city, as far as I remember. It's like Venice, but
yes.
Yeah. So that one, they're gearing this up to be this great city that you could explore and whatever, with gondolas and all this crap and whatever. And it was like, you go in and you can barely do anything, and I just felt so cheated. That I was planning this. Even there's a first city that you reach very early on in the game. I can't remember what its name, but there's Pot Noodle there. That's the only reason why I remember. It's like one of the main cities. That was also disappointing to me, because you couldn't really go into buildings or much. And I just felt kind of cheated, because even, old open world games, Final Fantasy, Square Enix, they're not short of a budget. You can walk into a building. It's not that difficult, and I felt that we were missing that rich experience. Abe, what are your thoughts on 15 in general?
Yeah, it took so long deciding. Well, like, it's a sentient thing, but it took so long figuring out what it was trying to be. and so much time then trying to be everything that it just didn't really excel. But even that aside, honestly, I feel like the biggest problem with it is the fact that its game structure is completely reversed, not only compared to the rest of Final Fantasy as a whole, but honestly most RPGs, most computer RPGs, right? Because you do, they don't all start with a very narrow kind of cross section of it, but usually that's what happens, and then it expands as you get used to it. I don't know. For me, like, the story in itself isn't uninteresting. I actually found the villain to be very compelling after I played his DLC. Like, I started to feel more for Prompto as a character, other than being kind of just this annoying dude. Again, after I played his DLC, which I didn't play until, I don't know, 2 years had passed since the release of the game, and I decided to go back to it. So I think there's a lot of good ideas there, and clearly we see a lot of it better executed in the guise of Final Fantasy VII Remake, like, without a doubt. But I don't know. It's just, I think that's just what happens when your development stretches out and your team changes, and they're reckoning with the complete dumpster fire that was the initial Final Fantasy XIV launch. So it's trying to do a lot of heavy lifting, and it just wasn't set up for it, I think.
Yeah, I think it was poorly executed in the end. I did enjoy the combat aspect that they did eventually bring over to the remake. I'm just wondering, Monster, considering that 7 is your... No, so, well, 9 is your favourite, but I know you really love 7 as well, because it holds a great important part in your life. But is there anything in 7 that is flawed, but you overlook it, and you're okay with overlooking it? Because I always wonder which...
Just a lot. I think the game as a whole is like stuck together with chewing gum and paper clips. It's very poorly programmed. And I think we were just talking about this before we started, like, that it was really rushed. I think the whole thing was done in a year, and the translation is very lackluster, and that, I think, it makes the story very confusing. I remember not really understanding a lot of the story when I played it as a child, and then it was only through watching YouTube videos where someone explains the correct translation that I actually understood what was going on. Like, and I think even to this day, like, even last year, some huge bug was found where you can skip an enormous part of the game. So yeah, just polish, I think. But maybe that adds to its charm a little bit too, that it's rough around the edges.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a way of looking at it, because I even remember when I was doing... So I sound like I am flexing, but when I was getting the platinum for Final Fantasy VII, the original one, I found that there was a lot of things, like those glitches, that I had to use just to make things a bit easier for myself. One of them was that you could get the Knights of the Round materia very, very early on through a glitch, which I appreciated. So it is kind of like, yeah, for a lot of those games, you can gloss over the flaws because you love them so much as well. I think the difficult thing is that if it actually ages badly, which is really tough, when it can be particularly tough when it comes to dialogue or just how a character reacts. I know there's one scene in particular in Final Fantasy IX, even there's one scene where Princess Garnet is boarding an airship in Dali, and she's walking up it, and then Zidane touches her butt, and it's just like, that's not aging very well. It's those little things, but you can, I suppose, not gloss over, but acknowledge that it's problematic and then move on with the rest of it. But as long as you can kind of see that and not really laugh at it anymore, I think that makes it it can still be a really good experience. Ave, in terms of flaws in 6, what kind do you think, is there anything that you perhaps glossed over?
In 6, I would say the biggest thing that I don't really, at the time I was in 6th grade, I would have been 10, 11 years old maybe. Probably the biggest problem is the whole character of Umaro and also Gao, the two wild men.
Yes.
Gao especially.
Yeah.
That's a very problematic trope. At the time, completely over my head. Looking at it now, it is concerning. But for the most part, I would say, because of the limitation, I'm not giving it a free pass, but because of the limitations of the technology, the 16-bit kind of style of game, there wasn't a lot of areas to play around, for better and for worse. So everything really had to be through dialogue. So it's really only in those, like, caricatures of characters that you see that it really, going back to it, is like maybe not so good. So I think, though, in the case of 6, it had the attention of a translator for an extended period of time, unlike 7, which had a guy presumably and a spreadsheet in 2 weeks to do it. So it had some care, and of course, at the time, it would have been released under the auspices of Nintendo, who were extremely intense about what you could and could not put in games, to the point that all the alcohol in Final Fantasies for the Super Nintendo, at least in the U.S., it was all root beer. I mean, root beer. Still, the word beer was there, but it's soda. It's Coke, whatever. So that's kind of. I think they lucked out, and that's maybe why those have aged a little bit better in that sense. But as soon as you get to those zones where you've got a higher production value and can do more, you're going to want to do more, and you don't always know how well that's going to age, I guess.
Yeah, and for my own curiosity, have you played the Final Fantasies in Japanese?
I have played most of them in Japanese. I haven't completed them all in Japanese. Played 6 in Japanese. I played a chunk of 7. Played 10, 12, and 13 in total, like completely through in Japanese. I don't find for the modern ones, honestly, I don't notice too many issues with the translation. It's really you see it with the older ones, especially when they broke onto the play. Oh yeah, I also played 8 and 9 in Japanese first. Yeah, I mean, the translations for most of the modern games, except for 7, are actually pretty solid, I would say. A little weird sometimes, but generally pretty on point.
Yeah, that is definitely something that I always wanted to do, is to play a Final Fantasy in Japanese, or particularly the reason why I started learning Japanese is because I wanted to experience these things in the language that I was meant to be in, because I know that it's quite a different experience. I know that, even a side note, in terms of anime that's been subbed and dubbed, and that's like a completely separate argument. I don't really care personally, but there is a difference in translation. You miss some nuances between the language because the translator is obviously doing a job to try and get the flow of it, but it mightn't be necessarily exactly what's being portrayed. But I want to ask you, Monster, in particular, because I know you were joking in our group chat that you have a 10,000 word essay on why every Final Fantasy sucked after 10.
Good point.
So
what's the length?
Yeah, what's the length of this podcast?
So I think you can break it down to 2 main reasons. The first is that enemies level up with you. Like, so one of my favorite, you start out very weak and you should very slowly progress. And I like to over grind in beginning areas, so I'm overpowered. Grinding in Final Fantasy VIII, coming back to the starting area on this 3, and then one-shotting all the enemies that used to be so difficult. And then the second reason is a terrible protagonist. He's not a very good leader. Someone who grew up in kind of military school type of culture. Like, he's very whiny and he's selfish. And even though the world is ending and he needs to save it, he just spends so much time brooding and feeling sorry for himself. And I think that makes him very unlikable. Yeah, I think those are the 2 main reasons.
That is, you know what, in terms of protagonists, that is a huge issue with a lot of, I mean, yes, Van, or any of those kind of protagonists in general are really super irritating. But thankfully, the good thing is that you have the supporting cast. Thank God, because if you didn't have a supporting cast, particularly in 12, it would just not be... 12 unfortunately is one that I still haven't finished properly. I actually enjoy many aspects of it, but the Gambit system I actually really like in the Zodiac Age, the revamped version. I didn't like it in the original one, but I liked what they chose to do in the new one. Yeah, the protagonist has a huge impact on if you're actually going to enjoy a game, even a TV series, transitioning over that way. And I think... I'm trying to think of the ones that actually came after 10. It is probably fair, apart from 14, which I'm going to leave to you, Abe, to talk about 14, because I have not played it, so I don't know. But I think that, and aside from the remake, which was done exceptionally well, because I was super worried about it, partly because it was one of those things where, we don't need a remake, but then when the remake actually happened, I was like, we do need a remake. So now I'm kind of trying to entice people to make a Final Fantasy IX remake, so I can always hope. But Eve, can you tell me about Final Fantasy XIV? Because I really want to hear more about it, because I just never got into it.
So, I mean, the kind of short way I describe it to people, especially if they're...
Yeah, I'd like to hear that too.
Yeah, for people who are longtime Final Fantasy fans who have not played it, the easiest way to describe it is it is a world that is built on the core, tenets of Final Fantasy lore. There are summons, everything draws power from crystals, there are elements tied to these crystals and to everything around you in the world, and then they essentially pluck tropes, objects, obviously spells, classes from basically anything across the history of Final Fantasy, and they kind of work it into the game. The way I believe the director has referred to it in the past is basically it's a Final Fantasy theme park, but that does sell it a bit short because, and I'm gonna kind of like slightly ignore the initial like 2.0 release, because the story there, which they've acknowledged and they've actually patched out a bunch of like tedious content, wasn't the greatest. But essentially what they've done is they've taken the plot of, or a lot of plot threads from 12, basically. It's very heavily 12 influenced, and woven it into a story of resistance against this evil empire. But they also put in some big bad looming bad guys over, you know, off to the side for future kind of adventure. And what they've done is given you a way to be the hero in Final Fantasy, build a party. I mean, you can level up NPCs to go on adventures with. You can level up your chocobo. Later on, you get to actually just take story NPCs with you into dungeons. And they've essentially given you an episodic Final Fantasy, like actually. So like the first episode is 2.0, and you learn the stakes, you beat back the Empire, but not all the way. And then the next story, you go into an isolated land. It's very Game of Thronesy, the haves and have-nots fighting each other under the backdrop of this like ancient war. Also cool. Then after that, you kind of return to the initial war. There's a big war there. You get to become a war hero, and it also then sets up what is the current expansion, which a lot of people have said that it's probably the best Final Fantasy game, just this expansion that's been around for a long time. And I would say, certainly story-wise, it has been, for me, since 12, and 12 took some getting into because it does start slow. But other than that, I'd say it's one of the more compelling stories that we've seen in a long time from Final Fantasy. And I don't want to spoil it too much, but essentially there's like a parallel. It goes very deep into the cosmology, and essentially gives you a way to put all the Final Fantasies into the same actual scape of the universe.
Yeah.
As essentially different reflections of each like, so there's like the core world, which is where Final Fantasy XIV mostly happens on, but there's a bunch of reflections. So at the time the game came out, it was the 14th. There are 13 other reflections, and we have now adventured to at least one of those, but you also deal with reflection enemies and heroes from one of the other reflections, which is strongly implied to have been Final Fantasy III from the NES days. And it's all there. You can go to Dalmasca, you can go to Rabanastre in Final Fantasy XIV. Like it's wild. So it is like every Final Fantasy crammed into one.
I mean, that's exceptional. No, I can tell you're super passionate about it, because I was like, yes, this sounds like, no, that's really great, because that is what you want from a game, right? You know, you really want that enriching experience that you're going to play for hours on end. Well, personally, that's what I want as an RPG gamer. But I'm curious, because so with this, right? Because this is the reason why I haven't bought it, is because you have to pay for it monthly, right? So that was the thing that always put me off, because I felt like if I didn't want to commit that much to it.
Quite a generous free trial, I think. I think you get all the way to level 30 or something.
So actually now you can get all the way through the first expansion. So you can go all the way up to level 60 now.
Wow. Which is...
As soon as you buy it, like as soon as you actually buy a license for the rest of the stuff, you got to sign up for the monthly fee. But yeah, it's a very generous free trial. Let's face it, we all have a lot of time at home right now. So.
This is true. And I wonder then, though, in terms of the actual, so say I bought the monthly package, right? And I'm not asking for the terms and conditions, but in general, is it a situation that when you stop playing, it's stuff taken away from, or stop paying rather, is stuff taken away from you? How does it work? Or
no, your account just kind of gets essentially frozen. So if you pay again in the future, all your stuff will be right there.
Right, but you can't play it though.
No.
Yeah. No. Okay. Right. Yeah. So if I was sitting on level 59 or something, or oh no, wait, sorry, you said the whole first expansion is free.
The whole first expansion, so you could go all the way up to level 60 on all of the crafting jobs, all the gathering jobs, and all the combat jobs, except for the 4 that have been added since that came out.
Right.
So. It's a lot.
I mean, I'm definitely tempted to buy just for that expansion, just to at least have that experience, because, you know, as a dedicated fan myself, I know that was literally the only reason that was holding me back, was that commitment, which doesn't in one way make any sense considering the amount of games that I buy in general.
For me, it was like, I've never let my subscription for it lapse since it went into 2.0. but like I know because I was one of the sufferers of 1.0, I have a reduced subscription plan, so it's actually $5 cheaper than new players per month.
Nice.
So every 6 months it costs me $50, and I 100% get enough hours of entertainment for that to not feel like a major investment. Even if I just do the new content that they release every 3 months and get the new, like, see the new stuff, do the new story, mess around with the new like gimmicks they add in, it doesn't bother me. But I do understand the trepidation at that. If I wasn't such a patsy for Square Enix, I probably wouldn't stay subscribed indefinitely. But
do you think that as well, as Final Fantasy fans, maybe Monster, you could inform me about on this one, because I know that you haven't played the most recent ones, but do you feel a situation where, because you're a formerly Square Enix fan, that you just buy stuff? Like, would you feel like you'd have to be, you're kind of, what's the word, you're loyal to the brand in one way?
Not really anymore. I mean, there definitely was a point where if it had the Square logo on it, I would buy it. But like, I think the games industry generally has kind of lost its way, and like you see with the, I think they made that new Avengers game, Square Enix did, and it's a very soulless cash grab kind of looter shooter game, and I think they've gone the way of all those other big AAA companies where they just, it's all about getting the microtransactions over it really being a work of art and putting real love into it, you know?
That's,
So yeah, not so much anymore.
I'm in the opposite camp, because I think I still feel that kind of brand loyalty, and I know I shouldn't, but it's kind of one of those things where unless there's something major that they've done terribly, then I probably will, you know, I probably still buy the game. I mean, I own, this kind of leads us on to one of the most hated games in the entire Final Fantasy series, which is 13. I mean, I own all 3 of them, and I haven't played the last one because I hated the first 2 as I played them. And it was one of those things where I just felt, I was even reluctant to buy them. I was like, I really know I'm not going to enjoy these, and it's one of those things there I just was like, oh, I guess I'll try it. I'll just see what's the whole fuss about. And it's funny because what year do we know what year 13 came out? Because I can't remember.
2010.
2010. What a year, huh?
I did some research this morning.
Nice.
Because I had some things to say about 13.
Okay. Well, this is perfect. 2010. So what was really interesting about that time in particular, because I was thinking, yes, that makes sense, because social media wasn't as big as it was now, right? And in general, you know, YouTube essays, any of those kind of things. So in one way, we were limited in terms of how we thought about the game. And I feel like sometimes with newer Final Fantasies and games in general, because we're watching so many reviews, because we're reading so many things online and perhaps prejudging things, maybe we don't give them a fair chance at, you know, at making it or breaking it or whatever. With 13, I can't remember where I heard it was crap. I honestly can't. I just remember hearing the word linear, which I also think is an interesting word to use anyway, considering how we've spoken about the linearity between games to date and how you can do it well or whatever. But I am interested in hearing Abe's thoughts on 13, and there's also something I just want to mention briefly, but I think it's worth expanding on, is how 10, I was going to say X, no one says X, 10 is an example of a linear game done well, done the right way, in my opinion. And there's a lot of things going for it, which I don't think that 13 hit. I also think one of the issues to do with 13 is that if it wasn't called a Final Fantasy, it might have been received much better, but it was under the same branch, and we were so used to big RPGs that made sense and not a nonsensical plot where we honestly don't know what's going on with Lissy. But anyway, let's go. Hey, fire away.
So like the context is Final Fantasy, certainly the main lines, they certainly since the PlayStation era, they're always kind of at the forefront of pushing the technology they exist on, and they are kind of an encapsulation of where RPG design might be at that time, but usually with some experimental ideas in them. So like with that in mind, 13, when it came out, so basically I think part of the reason why it has it's not great. Like it really isn't, but part of the reason why we've received it so poorly is it was, you know, it went into development around the time that these very linear cinematic game experiences were really starting to pop off. You know, we had Uncharted 1 and 2 before it released. There was Call of Duty specifically going into Modern Warfare 1 and 2. There, you know, Halo 3 came out in 2007, and 13 had already been in development for a couple of years at that point. I think part of, so the linear kind of, I hesitate to use the word cinematic because the game doesn't actually feel cinematic, but that approach I think is informed by that period, for better or for worse. And I do suspect that if it had come out a couple of years earlier, we might have received it a little more kindly, but that doesn't sidestep the problem where the game is really just Nomura and his team obsessively showing you the game that they want to show you and not giving you the choice that you expect from an RPG, even their own previous RPGs. 10 has a very similar sort of very straight and linear, and then it branches out at the end for a bit. 13 has the same thing. It's the same basic flow, but 10 doesn't treat you like an idiot. It gives you most of the tools very early. I mean, sure, if you're watching all the cutscenes and stuff, it maybe be an hour and a half before you get there. In Final Fantasy 13, you don't get experience points for 3 hours if you are playing the game and not skipping the cutscenes. You don't get experience points. You've just been doing fights and you get nothing. Then you get the major combat mechanic is the swapping of roles mid-fight. You don't even get all the roles that you'll be able to swap to initially. They dole them out to the point that, again, if you're watching all the cutscenes, you're going to hit 18 hours before your entire suite of combat abilities is there. And then the training wheels come off. Like, that is a long time for any game. And it just treats the player like they don't know how to play a game, which at this point, this level of engagement should be second nature to most of the people jumping into here, because I don't think this is a great starting Final Fantasy, because if you really want to get to grips to it, you're going to spend a ton of time in the menu reading through lore entries. The references to other Final Fantasies are not as prominent. It's just like they had a vision that they did not compromise for at all, to the detriment of the game. It's just, I mean, even experience points, once you get them, you get almost the exact amount you need to unlock every node in the Crystarium by the time you get to the next section. There's no choices to make. It's not interesting. But it's like, if it had come out in like 2008 or 2007, I suspect we would have been like, wow, visuals amazing, story kind of insane, but let's get real, it's a Japanese RPG. Like, production value is great. Honestly, the voice acting isn't that bad either, but it's just, it's a game that got frozen in time and then released a couple years later. And I think 13.2 tried to fix a lot of what those problems were, but it still doubled down on the craziness. And like, I mean, then there's time travel and like war between some gods that you really don't know about unless you sat around reading every data entry in the previous game. It's just, this might be controversial. It is what happens when you give Nomura tons of money and free reign and say, you're the boss, and he makes only what he wants to make. I think he learned in Final Fantasy VII that, which I think the remake, I mean, like, you have to, it is a delicate act, but the fans can't not be part of that. Like, the fandom, I don't mean they have to be actively engaged, but like, it's one thing when you're making an indie game and you're like an auteur, but like when you are spending this much money on a thing that is intended for mass consumption, you can't then take your audience and treat them like they're a bunch of idiots and expect them to eat it all up.
Yeah, I mean, those are totally fair and absolutely valid points. And even with that, I mean, the fact that it wasn't just one game, it was 3.
No, it was 3.
I
also never played Lightning Returns because I was like, you know what, I'm good.
Yeah, same here. I mean, one day maybe I will play it. I have no interest. It sits on my shelf. I look at it going, and I feel like I should at one stage go back and play the 13 series with maybe another lens or whatever. But from all the points that you outlined there, I totally agree. In terms of the voice acting, I think one of my biggest issue was Lightning herself as a character, as a protagonist. I found her just super bland. I just don't understand why people find her cool. She's really dull, and there's nothing apart from looking cool. She looks super, and you know, it's always one of those things where Square Enix, I find in general, they were always really good at highlighting graphics and how characters looked, and it's very vibrant and everything like that. And they always got brownie points for that from me, because it was like, yeah, I want to wear that, I want to cosplay that or whatever. The problem with Lightning is that she looks cool, but she's also super boring. And just her family. I don't care about her family story. I'm sorry. I wish I did, but I have no idea. I don't care about any of the Lassie stuff. I don't really care about most of the supporting cast either, which is super unfortunate. There are some glimpses of what I would like to be interested in, like Snow's character and stuff like that. You know, there's something that could have been picked up super earlier or whatever, but I just find that her as a protagonist is always fascinating to me, that, and the people who say that 13 is their favorite also completely baffles me. But I always find that it's usually the case that they haven't played other Final Fantasies, like the really older ones, understood what it was like back in our day to appreciate that world. But sure, look, anyway, Monster, have you played 13?
I haven't played it. I've seen people stream it quite a bit, and yeah, I agree with Avaelin that like there's a way to make a game linear without making it feel linear. But just watching people play 13, it looks like you're running through the same narrow corridor with different art assets copied and pasted into it at different times, you know, and so it feels much more like a video game and less like a real adventure. And I think like the best Final Fantasy games, they don't really feel like a video game. They feel like you really are on an adventure. Yeah, and so I can see why 13 is not well liked.
Yeah, I mean, it's no wonder that it's not available on other. It's not. We won't see a remaster of 13 anytime soon. If they actually announced we're going to remake 13, I'd be like, "Are you?"
You can play it on the Xbox One with 4K textures if you really want to.
Oh, but why? I can't even imagine that, because I do think it looked really well. I think just in general, they did
Initially,
really.
It was gorgeous.
Yeah.
Indisputably, it was a gorgeous game to look at, for sure.
Yeah, and if only they had worked on the plot and other aspects of the game. I wondered then, so with the announcement of 16, and I think we all saw the trailers for 16, which have bizarrely British accents, and I'm not quite sure what was going on with that. What do we think that 16 is going to look like? Because I feel like they did hint at that during was 16 the one that they hinted at in Kingdom Hearts 2 or Kingdom Hearts 3, or what Kingdom Hearts are we on? I can't remember. That's a game I also, I don't know, but
well, there's like 11 of them, but 3 in the main series. Yeah.
Yes, oh yeah, there's 11 of them, but the main one, there was a thing where they had they were teasing something within it, but I think that could have been a reference to Versus, which was the side project thing, but I can't remember, so people can correct me on that if I'm wrong. But Monster, what do you think 16 is going to be like?
I remember not being very impressed by it. Like, usually when I see a Square trailer or a Final Fantasy trailer for a next generation game, like the graphics always look 20% better than every other game on that platform that I've seen. But it didn't really look, it didn't look like anything that could be done on the PlayStation 4, to be honest. It didn't pull my mind in the same way that Square trailers usually do. And it kind of looked like they just made an Excel spreadsheet of different Final Fantasy tropes. Like, I think there was Moogles in there somewhere, or there's Chocobos, like, and just let's put them all into a big soup and make it a trailer. You know what I mean? So it didn't look particularly inspiring, but like, yeah, it was a 3-minute trailer, so it's hard to tell if it's going to be good or not.
Yeah, it is tricky, and I wonder what a chocobo soup would be like. I feel bad for even thinking about that right now.
Sounds delicious.
I know, right? But 16, the biggest thing that threw me, apart from not particularly caring about, well, I mean, I'm always excited to see a Final Fantasy in general, just to see, okay, what are they going to do next? But yeah, it's the accents that so threw me off, and I think it's because, I mean, people can correct me if this is wrong, but to me, the accents felt put on. It didn't sound like a British person. I don't know if maybe they are British or they were asked to overhype it a bit, but for me, I always find that they always revert to British accents when they want people to sound fancy. And I'm like, we have fancy people in different walks of life. They don't have to sound like this regal kind of, you can sound regal in different ways. And I just felt that it was quite jarring as well, because obviously, with these type of games, we always have, at the end of the day, it's a JRPG, right? So to have these accents are sometimes very off-putting, especially when you have maybe more Americanized accent when we think about 10 or whatever. There was a nice vibrancy when it came to accents. I think that with this, it's slightly missing the mark because it just doesn't suit how the characters are looking or the characters are rendering. And I just think that you're right, Monster. I feel like it is there. It looks initially like a case that they are throwing everything into it, and it looks like they're going down the kind of medieval type route as well, story wise. So instead of a more dystopian type look to the game. Ave, do you know more about 16 or?
So yeah, I have some additional info, which might.
Ooh.
I mean, it's not like secret info or anything. In regards to the accents, I do agree with that, and I think that's a function of the resources that they kind of brought to bear in Final Fantasy XIV, particularly following the first expansion when they recast all the voice actors, and I think it's also a callback to the English voice acting tracks in 12, which had lots of accented characters. I mean, the main plucky little guy Vaughn, who I really could do without, obviously has his American accent. But so I think that's part of it, and that's partly because the director is the director of Final Fantasy XIV, Naoki Yoshida. So he, I think it's tough to say right now. It's definitely going to be very medievally. It's going to have lots of call outs to other Final Fantasies because that's kind of his thing. At least if you take 14 as kind of like the primary source of his sort of creative output at Square right now. But I think it'll be interesting to see. Visually, it'll probably improve. I suspect they're using a modified version of the engine that powers 14, which is maybe why it's not so shiny and new. I suspect there will be a lot of work done to that because we do know how Square likes its showpieces. But one thing that gives me a lot of hope for it, and I think for the industry in general, if others kind of glom onto this, is the director Yoshida. He was very, very serious about he only wanted actual in-game engine footage, no pre-rendered anything. So that's why I think people are a little like, it's pretty janky. Like, it's not what we would expect. And he was like, it's in development, but I didn't want to do anything pre-rendered at. He was like, I'm sick of seeing these trailers for games that are pre-rendered and then it doesn't look like that. So respect there. But I mean, yeah, it's going to be a medieval-ish, Western Europe-inspired tale of revenge and family, and it's going to hit all the tropes. It really is. It's just a question of how good it feels, like how well the combat's implemented, the level of customization. If they can hit that, I think that even if visually it's not as outwardly stunning as like a 15 was when it hit, I think it'll be okay.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest as well, there's only so far you can go with visuals, right? Until they're actually humans that you're using on your screen. Yeah. And I think I'm okay with that. If it doesn't, even if it looked like 15, I would also be okay with that. Because for me, the biggest thing is the plot. And is it a Final Fantasy game? Is it something that I can call a Final Fantasy game? And that's super important to me in general. I obviously the combat wise, it does have to be. It does have to work. It doesn't have to feel. Right. I don't mind if things aren't turn-based because I feel like obviously we've moved on for things that things don't necessarily have to be turn-based anymore. Turn-based is still really cool and I still love it. But I understand that that's something that, even to entice other audiences, you kind of take away that element. Although it would be nice to have two options, but that's asking for a lot.
I agree. If they keep pushing that model that they created in 15 and kind of like improved on for 7 Remake, if that's kind of where they're coming in with the combat, then like I'm not even worried about that part because it didn't feel bad in 15 and it felt great in Remake.
Yeah.
In my opinion, anyway.
Yeah, there are two things that I ask for in games in general, and if they are absent, I get really sad. 1, the ability to dodge roll. 2, the ability to jump.
Yes.
In general, not outside of combat. I just love being able to jump on things.
That was a big feature request. In 1.0 of 14, you could not jump.
Oh.
And there were like fences and stuff all over. So like that was one of the first things when Yoshida took over was just like, and yes, you'll be able to jump in the new implementation. It's
so important. This reminds me actually, two things. First of all, the rendering thing is very funny because I'm always thinking back to when they launched Spider-Man and people were giving out that the water didn't look good enough for people. And I was like, really? That's the thing you're deciding to focus in on right now? And the game was really, really good in the end. So, and they did improve on the water, but that's like a completely side thing. So Monster, I'm just wondering then, if you were to think of an ideal Final Fantasy game, right? In a new one, what would be the how would you imagine that kind of game to come about?
I think the big parts for me are that the cast gets along very well, like the relationships between the characters. Like, protagonist is important, but I think their relationship to the entire cast is a lot more important than how the main party gels together. I feel like it's a real lived-in world that you can go into houses and every NPC has a little line of dialogue that reveals a little bit of personality or tells you more about the world and what the class structure is like, what the culture is like. Well, obviously the RPG it has some creative way to cast magic, whether it's like materia or GFs or what was this? Nine? Yeah, Eidolons. Yeah. And I think, like you said, like it's really 90% about the story and that you feel like you're on an adventure. And I'll put up with a lot of gameplay wise if there's a good story.
Yeah, I think what you said there is really important, that the world is lived in and not otherwise it can be super jarring when you're like, was this box just placed here to just fill the screen, or is there a reason why this is actually here?
Yeah, I'm hopeful. So those points exactly, I think that's why I'm hopeful with the guy who they've got at the helm, Yoshida, from like Final Fantasy XIV. It is an MMO. You got markers on your map. You go from point to point. But certainly in the smaller settlements and in a lot of the larger areas, there are interiors to buildings. There are NPCs talking to each other, and if you want to sit and see their little conversation, sure, it'll be the same conversation forever. But like, you can sit and see it. There's lots of details like that. So I do have high hopes that that's the kind of thing that's gonna be in this game. I'm really curious to see what he and his team can do when they don't have to cater to a MMO content schedule where they've got to keep players engaged over extended periods of time. So I don't know. I am hopeful, but it's also so tough to tell. And to be frank, they put out that teaser website, and I have not looked at it yet on purpose. I want to reduce the amount of spoilers I can if possible. So
yeah, it's all about reducing that hype, because even for 7 Remake, I was like, I'm not going to watch everything. I'm just going to leave it sit there, because yes, it looks really good in trailers, but you know, trailers be trailing, and we don't know if it's actually going to end up being the actual experience that we want it to be. Speaking of just the immersive experience, another thing to make it more immersive is actually naming your characters, naming the NPCs. Instead of having man 1, woman 1 or whatever, I really like sometimes that they have little things like scorned woman with bread roll, just random things that they can add that just, it enhances it without being, stupid. There's more context to the world, it adds it. Especially in things like 9, where it just gets, there's bizarre descriptions and you kind of just roll with it. I'm just wondering then, so would you prefer a remake of a Final Fantasy or a new Final Fantasy? Ava, I'll start with you.
A remake or a new one? Well, I am very curious to see what 16 is like, but I would really love to see one of the... It could be any of the SNES ones get a little love via a remake that isn't just really terrible pixel art like remastering. Like, that would be wild. 4, I think, would be a perfect candidate because it has, again, it's more linear for the entirety of the game than 6. 5 is completely bonkers. Like, I mean, the story is linear, but like the gameplay is so freeform as to be almost unintelligible when compared to 4 and 6. So it would be wild to see a Super Nintendo era one remade. Honestly, I would say I would voluntarily say let's ice 16 for a minute, just to, like, that would be so cool. 9-year-old me would be way pumped for that.
Yeah, in terms of 4 though, 4 was technically sort of remade in terms of they made them more 3D.
Yeah, I don't really... So I wasn't going to talk about the Final Fantasy IV DS remake.
Go on. Go for it.
It's not bad, but it's a different game. It's not like 7 Remake where they were like, cool, we see you, but we're going to tell a slightly different story, but with the characters you know and love. The 4 Remake on DS was like, we're going to tell the exact same story with better visuals, except we're just going to make everything a lot harder to fuck with you. and I'm like, that's not, just add in a hard mode or something. That's fine. But I don't know. I had a tough time with it.
Did you play the After Years?
I did not like the After Years.
Okay, I haven't played the After Years. I own it, but I just wanted to play it just to see where the story went for my own curiosity. But I felt that I had to replay 4 before I played the After Years, and I'm just halfway through playing. No, I say normal 4 or like original 4 before. Yeah. So I'm not sure how that's going to. That's a curious route that I have to take.
Yeah, my favorite version of Final Fantasy IV is the version that they released on the PSP. You can also play it on the Vita if you happen to be lucky enough to have one of those.
I do.
And it has After Years on it, but that's my preferred edition of Final Fantasy IV.
Yeah, 4 is actually a fantastic game. I remember really, really enjoying it when I was playing it, so it's something that I would definitely like to revisit. Monster, what about you?
I would really like to see a 9 remake. I think that would be incredible. In the same style as 7. I don't think it's ever going to happen. I think they just did 7 because it was the most iconic. But yeah, I'd pick a 9 remake over Final Fantasy 17 any day.
With 9, I feel that... Okay, so 9 is a favourite of a lot of people, but I don't think it's as of much of a favourite as 7 was a favourite. I think you're right in that respect, that they would probably do something else. They might do 10, actually, is what they probably would over 9, I would imagine, to jazz it up. I know that they have obviously remastered 10 and didn't fix the lip syncing, but whatever. But it's just one of those things where I just don't feel... I mean, I would love to see 9. I've seen some renders that people have done on YouTube of 9, of how it could potentially look revamped, and it looks absolutely incredible. My heart just really, really wants it. I would be with one that I actually curiously would like to see as a remake in general. I still want to see the series go on, because I think that the world is over reliant on remakes in general, not even just in gaming, but in the movie world and any type of world. But one that I would love to see a remake of is 8, because 8 is so bananas, and I would just love to see, would they rectify all the plot?
Yeah.
So, would you like to see that, Abe?
I would love to see that. I actually really love Final Fantasy VIII, and I replayed it when they re-released it, whenever that was in the last year or so. I really like 8. It's bonkers. Even the mechanics themselves are bonkers. The characters can be hit or miss. Squall is not to my liking, but I mean, it's so out there. Like, it is. Like, I mean, Final Fantasy VII is out there, but like 8, like where the major plot the plot of the villain is to flatten time. That's wild. Like, that's absolutely bananas. But it's great. It's great and it's awful. So it would be really cool to see a remake of that for sure.
I know that a lot of people just shit on 8 anyway, but I totally, because it is so wacky, and I totally understand that, because especially when I was playing through it and I was like, okay, I can see little elements of here going a bit bananas. I'm kind of going to roll with it because they seem to have at least some sort of basis for this. Oh, we're in space? How did we get here all of a sudden? We're going to blow up. We're going to send missiles to... Okay, this is... And it just got crazier and crazier and crazier. And I actually think, though, there are so many amazing elements to 8 in general. Like, the junction system, it can be OP straight away. But it's actually really fun to mess around with. You know, when you kind of get... Like, you are OP, it's like, yes, I'm going to just one-shot kill you and feel pretty cool about it, too. And I think that a lot of people were dismissive of the junction system because they didn't know how to use it. But when you do, I don't know.
Guilty is charged.
Yeah.
It's the thing, though. It's like, it is a very designery game mechanic, but it's so cool because it's not like it accidentally lets you break the game. It's like, come on, let's see how bad you can break this thing, which is wild and not a thing you see a lot in AAA titles, like, at all, really, unless there's been a terrible mistake. So it's absolutely bonkers. Also, side note, like, we've hardly talked about the music. The music to 8 was, like, as far as the quality of the samples and stuff used, like, the music in 7 is great, don't get me wrong, but the actual quality of the instruments and just audio fidelity was like, this is coming out of my video game? You know, it was so cool.
Except for when you had to make your own concert. Then it wasn't cool. That was an absolute disaster for me in Fisherman's Horizon, where I was like, choose the right instruments to go with this concert that Selfie wants to suddenly put on. And I think I put like the worst concert on, and then Squall and Renoa were like, this sounds interesting. But anyway, as a last question for the both of you, Solly is asking in the chat. So I'm pretty sure it was Solly. He's asking, So, Monster, what Final Fantasy would you recommend for a beginner, someone who's just going into the series for the first time?
A part of me wants to say 7, but I think that it is aged too poorly for someone who doesn't have the nostalgia goggles like we would replaying it. So I think 10. I think 10 is like it's the best mix of being a Final Fantasy story while at the same time being really polished and having good graphics and the voice acting. Like, I think a first time player, you don't want to read through the equivalent of thousands of pages of dialogue. It's just more palatable, I think, for a new player.
Yeah, so what would you think, Eve?
Well, so I suspected you were going to say 10, and I'm glad you did, because I do think it is one of the perfect entry points, especially the newer editions, because it does have that level of polishing and design, but also is pretty wide open. But for the purposes of kind of like hitting on something different, I kind of have, it's kind of a cheat. It's like two recommendations. One, if you're okay with like hardcore, like you die in a dungeon, you've got to go all the way back to the start of the dungeon. The Final Fantasy III, like original 3 remake that they put on the DS and is now on like everything. It's on Steam, it's on phones. That is a really pure distillation of the very basic Final Fantasy mythos, a full-fat version of the job system. It is hard. So if you're okay with that, then that's a great entry level, because you don't have to deal with all the weird, like, crazy plot devices and stuff. It's very straightforward. My other recommendation would be, honestly, 14, just play the free trial, because it gives you so much that is Final Fantasy from all these different parts of the canon. You don't even have to dip into the additional expansions, but it's a very solid experience. I was going to say 12, but it's a little more complex, and you'll get a lot of those vibes from 14. Which is, has been built in the last decade, as opposed to, was entering development in like 2000 or 2001, whatever.
Yeah, I think that 14 is a great recommendation. I haven't even played it, but I would say that is a super suggestion because of exactly what you've laid out. Even though Final Fantasy IX is my favorite, I actually wouldn't recommend it as the entry point, because, as we mentioned before, it is such a love letter to all the other games that it will be quite difficult to maybe get all the reference that made it so special as a game. I think that 10 is also an excellent suggestion. The only thing with 10 is that it can be quite long in terms of cutscenes that might put people off initially, just in the beginning and stuff like that, if they're thinking of a Final Fantasy game. I would say the remake. I'm just taking out everyone's I would say, but I would say the Final Fantasy VII remake, but I think it's too polished, and I think that if you played that and you went back and tried to play games, you would just be like, well, this isn't like the remake. So, yeah, that would be one of the issues.
Ultonian Wolf in the chat mentioned Bravely Default, and even though it's not technically a Final Fantasy, it is. I don't know if you've played it, but with the second one also coming to the Switch soon, that might be an ideal one. It can be really crunchy and chewy as far as like game systems, but it's also very easy to pick up and get into.
Yeah,
gives me an idea. Kingdom Hearts, I think, has the first one has a story that is as good as any Final Fantasy, and it has the real-time RPG. So like turn-based combat is not for everybody, and I think the real-time RPG, action RPG style of combat may be a lot more appealing to some people.
Yeah, no, Kingdom Hearts is great. Actually, one of my biggest disappointment with the latest Kingdom Hearts was that there was no Final Fantasy characters in it, even though I was furious. I played this because of the crossover between Disney and Final Fantasy. I don't want just Disney. As much as I love Disney, that's not for me. One thing that we have overlooked, which is a phenomenal Final Fantasy game, is Final Fantasy Tactics, which is like one of my favorite. It's just, so it's exceptionally good, and Final Fantasy fans know how good it is, but outside of the Final Fantasy bubble, it's one that's so often overlooked, and it's just exceptionally good as a turn-based game where actually your decisions do matter, because if your characters die, well...
It's amazing, and also on your phone if you want it to be. So
there you go. You can tell that we're all really big Final Fantasy fans here in chat, so I hope that you enjoyed our chats here about the series and our opinions on it. I feel like we could definitely go on more, and perhaps we will revisit this topic maybe down the line, and even maybe go over the same points that we did today, but I think it's worth reiterating because it is such a phenomenal series that has such a massive impact on the gaming world in general, and is not just in Japan. Obviously, it's a worldwide phenomenon. which is really, really impressive. So thank you so much, everyone who tuned into episode 4 of the Community Talk Show. My many, many thanks to Ave, thank you, and also to Monster for being here in the chat. We will be back next week, next Thursday, 8 p.m. GMT, hopefully, all going well, with another episode of the Community Talk Show.
Hello, just slotting this in at the end of 2020. The chances are is that the series has already ended, so feel free to check out the other episodes. The community in general and my own stream continues on over on Twitch, so if you want to tune in there, links will be in the description. Thanks, Slán go fóill.